The desert never forgets, even when 20 years pass in silence. It remembers the sound of tires against scorched asphalt, the echo of a voice fading into heat, and a single moment when ordinary life fractures forever. On July 18, 2003, in the sun-baked city of El Paso, Texas, 27-year-old Melissa Duran stepped out of a convenience store with a small bag in her hand. A surveillance camera caught the last clear image of her face as the headlights of an unfamiliar car swept across the frame. Minutes later, she was gone. 3 hours after that, her phone went dark. 2 days later, her car was found locked on a desert road leading toward the Franklin Mountains. Her purse still inside, the keys missing, and the world left asking one question: what happened between the store and the sand? For 2 decades, the wind carried only silence. Investigators aged, evidence gathered dust, and the city moved on. Yet in 2023, a single DNA strand pulled from that same car door brought the past roaring back to life, exposing a truth buried beneath 20 years of desert wind. What truly happened to Melissa Duran on that blistering Friday night in 2003? And who was the man whose fingerprints hid in plain sight for 2 decades? If you want to uncover the answers to these haunting questions, like this video and subscribe to Unscripted Tales. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode of Justice Unearthed from the sands of time. And tell us in the comments, from which city are you watching this cold case story? Let us reach 5,000 likes to keep bringing forgotten stories back to light. El Paso, Texas, a city of over 600,000 people, was still shimmering at 103 degrees Fahrenheit when Melissa Duran vanished. The air tasted of dust and metal. The neon signs along Montana Avenue flickered through heat haze, and the asphalt seemed to breathe. At 6 p.m., the sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Melissa left the County Public Service Center, her white blouse clinging to her shoulders, hair hastily tied back, exhaustion softened by routine. She clocked out, waved briefly to a coworker, and stepped into her silver Toyota Corolla, the steering wheel too hot to touch without a cloth. She turned on the radio. Sheryl Crow's voice drifted through static as she drove toward home. Somewhere between 2 intersections, she called her mother, her tone casual, promising she would stop at the store near Montana Avenue before dinner. It was the last voice her mother ever heard. At 6:58 p.m., the convenience store camera recorded her leaving. A simple frame, door sliding open, sunlight reflecting off glass, a small bag in her right hand. For a heartbeat, her eyes flashed as a pair of headlights crossed her face. The light swallowed her features, then the door closed, freezing her silhouette against the glare. That still image became the last trace of her life. The desert wind rose as darkness fell. By 9:30 p.m., her mother's calls went unanswered. By midnight, the signal was gone entirely. In a small house on the east side, Rosa Duran stood at the window, watching the empty street glow under a porch light, her reflection trembling in the glass. Outside, the night hummed with distant traffic and restless wind. Inside, a mother waited for a phone that would never ring again. That night marked the beginning of a mystery that would grip El Paso for 20 years. And as the heat pressed against the city walls, the desert beyond the Franklin Mountains quietly prepared to guard its newest secret. The clock on the wall ticked past 9 that night. The streets of El Paso were still burning from the day's heat, and the sky above the Franklin Mountains shimmered with faint orange haze. Inside a small house on the city's east side, Rosa Duran sat by the window, her phone resting on the table beside her. She had called her daughter 3 times already. Each call rang longer than the last before cutting off to silence. At first, she told herself Melissa must have stopped to meet a friend. Maybe traffic on Montana Avenue was slow. Maybe her phone battery had died. But deep down, something in the air felt wrong. The hum of passing cars outside faded. The stillness of the night seemed to hold its breath. She dialed again. This time there was no ring at all. Only a mechanical voice saying the number was unavailable. Rosa stood up and walked to the porch, looking down the quiet street. The porch light cast a pale circle on the driveway. The empty space where Melissa's car should have been stared back at her like a question that refused to go away. She sat back down, gripping the phone tighter. Each hour that passed felt longer than the one before. At 10, she called again. At 11, she called once more, whispering her daughter's name into the dark as if Melissa could somehow hear her. By midnight, she stopped pretending it was nothing. She checked with relatives, neighbors, and even hospitals. No one had seen her daughter. The air outside was heavy, carrying dust and the smell of hot asphalt. Somewhere far off, a train horn echoed through the night, hollow and distant. Rosa stood at the window again, her eyes fixed on the faint reflection of her daughter's graduation photo hanging beside the door. It felt as though the picture was watching her too, waiting for the phone to ring. The hours crawled. At dawn, when the first pale light touched the rooftops, Rosa finally picked up the phone once more. Her hands trembled as she dialed a different number. When the line connected, her voice was small but steady. She said, "My daughter has not come home. She left work last evening and never returned." The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and too slow for her racing heart. "We will send someone over right away." But the truth was, no one came right away. Hours passed before the first patrol car rolled quietly into the neighborhood, red lights flashing faintly against the pale walls. The sound of the engine breaking the early morning silence felt like both hope and fear. Rosa stepped outside, holding her daughter's photo close to her chest, her eyes searching the officers' faces for any sign of understanding. One of them nodded gently and said they would start a search. His tone was firm, but Rosa could tell he already knew this would not be simple. The morning sun rose higher over the desert city. Wind swept across the dry streets. Somewhere out there, the world had swallowed Melissa whole, leaving behind only questions and a mother's silent promise that she would not stop searching. And as the first police radios crackled to life, El Paso began to wake to the story that would haunt it for decades. The first rays of dawn stretched across El Paso, turning the desert sky into a pale wash of golden gray. The city was still quiet when two patrol cars rolled slowly down Rosa Duran's street, their red and blue lights cutting faint streaks through the morning dust. The air was already warm, heavy with the promise of another scorching day. Major Robert Salinas, head of the missing persons unit, stepped out of the lead car. He was a tall man with weary eyes, the kind that had seen too many cases begin this same way. He spoke briefly with Rosa, took her daughter's photo, and gave the order that would set the search in motion. By 5:40 a.m., the official operation had begun. Across the east side of the city, patrol units spread out along Montana Avenue and the winding roads that led toward the Franklin Mountains. A helicopter lifted from Fort Bliss, its blades thundering above the rooftops as it turned north. The desert below shimmered with haze, long shadows stretching like cracks over the ground. From above, the streets looked empty and endless. On the ground, teams of officers fanned out with K-9 units, the dogs moving low to the sand, sniffing at the faintest scent. Volunteers arrived soon after. Neighbors, off-duty workers, even strangers who had heard the news on local radio. They gathered at the Pebble Hills Community Center, clutching maps, water bottles, and flashlights. Someone handed out reflective vests. Someone else drew lines across a map, marking zones with thick red ink. Every name was written with hope, every zone with worry. The sun climbed higher. Heat rolled off the pavement in waves. The air carried the taste of metal and grit. Officers walked through empty lots, combed dry riverbeds, and scanned beneath bridges where only wind whispered through the gaps. Radios crackled with updates, short and sharp. "Team A, check the ridge. Team B, move east of Pole 57. Each reply was brief and steady, but the strain in their voices grew heavier with every passing hour. In the distance, the faint whir of the helicopter circled back. Its camera panned across the rocky terrain where sand met scrub and patches of dying grass. Nothing moved except the shifting waves of heat. Below, searchers pressed forward, sweat streaking down their faces, dust clinging to their boots. They overturned trash piles, inspected ditches, and knelt to study footprints that vanished after a few meters. Every sign led to nowhere. By noon, the temperature passed 108 degrees. The wind picked up, carrying thin veils of dust that stung the eyes and blurred the horizon. A young officer stopped to take a sip of warm water, then straightened again, unwilling to rest. Near a police SUV, Rosa stood silently, watching the search stretch out into the desert. Her daughter's photo was folded in her hand, the edges bent and worn. Every time a patrol car returned, she looked up, waiting for a nod, a sign, anything at all. But each time, the officers only shook their heads and moved on. The day dragged into late afternoon. The desert glowed red under the sinking sun. Radios grew quieter. Hope thinned, but no one left. The helicopter made one final pass before returning to base, its shadow sweeping across the sand like a ghost. As darkness crept in, the last volunteers packed up. The officers stayed longer, flashlights cutting narrow paths through the gloom. They searched until the batteries dimmed, and still they found nothing. No sign of Melissa, no clues. Only dust and silence. And somewhere beyond the reach of those flashlights, the desert wind moved through the canyons, carrying secrets it was not ready to share. 2 long days had passed since the search began, and the desert heat showed no mercy. The roads near the Franklin Mountains shimmered in the sunlight, empty except for the wind. Hope was fading, but that morning a call reached El Paso Police Headquarters that made every officer stop what they were doing. A long-haul truck driver had spotted a silver Toyota Corolla sitting alone on the shoulder of Trans Mountain Road. It looked like it had been there for days. Major Salinas ordered 2 patrol units to head out immediately. The road cut through the rocky hills like a thin scar, winding toward the mountains under a harsh white sky. As the officers approached the site, dust swirled in thick spirals and the distant sound of the truck's engine faded behind them. There, half buried in sand, stood a silver car tilted slightly to one side, its surface coated in a dull layer of desert dust. It was Melissa's car. The front tires were sunk into the sand. The windows were rolled up. The doors were locked. A faint reflection glimmered from inside, her purse on the passenger seat still neatly placed. The wallet, lipstick, and house keys lay untouched, as if she had only stepped away for a moment and never returned. But her car keys were gone. A forensic officer approached the driver's side, gloved hands steady, eyes narrowed. He leaned closer to the window. No broken glass. No scratches. No signs of forced entry. The car sat too calmly, too deliberately, as if someone had wanted it to be found exactly this way. When the lock was carefully opened using specialized tools, the heavy scent of sun-baked fabric and dust filled the air. Inside, the driver's seat was slightly reclined, pushed farther back than Melissa would have set it. The rearview mirror was tilted to the right. A dark smudge stained the gear shift. At first glance it looked like oil, but under the light it appeared darker, thicker. A sample was taken immediately. In the glove compartment, officers found an old gas receipt dated July 18, 7:12 p.m., from a station on Highway 62, more than 10 miles north of Melissa's route home. The time matched exactly when she had last been seen leaving the store. That detail made Salinas pause. She had gone the wrong way. Fingerprints were lifted from the windows, the door handles, and the steering wheel. Most belonged to Melissa, confirmed through samples from her home. But one stood out, a large, heavy print on the rear passenger door. It did not match hers or anyone in the household. Under the blinding desert heat, the print had half-dried, the ridges faint but visible. Forensic techs captured it, sealed it in evidence bags, and took a swab from the same area in hopes of retrieving sweat residue. The temperature soared past 111 degrees as they finished the inspection. The desert wind roared across the mountain pass, carrying dust that scraped against their skin like sandpaper. As the tow truck hooked the Corolla to its cable, one young officer muttered that only the desert could hide something for this long. Major Salinas did not answer. He kept his eyes on the horizon, the Franklin Mountains rising like silent witnesses in the distance. Back at the evidence lot, the car was placed under a temporary canopy. Technicians worked through the afternoon measuring everything: fuel level, seat position, mirror angle, tire marks. Every detail was logged. The mud on the floor matched the red sand found in the Trans Mountain area, not the light gray dust of Melissa's neighborhood. When the report came in that evening, it brought little comfort. The unknown fingerprint had no match in the database. The DNA swab was too weak for testing. And so, the mystery deepened. A car found without a driver. A purse untouched. A single print that belonged to no one. The desert had offered a clue, but not an answer. The sun climbed higher over the Franklin Mountains, burning through the haze that hung above the city. It had been 3 days since Melissa's car was found, and hope was starting to thin. Yet Major Salinas refused to stop. Early that morning, a forensic technician reviewing aerial footage noticed something faint just north of the road where the Toyota Corolla had been discovered. 2 narrow lines running parallel, cutting across the sand for nearly 300 meters before fading into open desert. Tire tracks. By noon, a small convoy of police vehicles rolled through the area. Dust trailed behind them as the wind picked up, bending the thin desert grass and carrying the dry scent of iron. The site was quiet, only the hum of engines and the rhythmic crunch of boots breaking the silence. Technicians moved carefully, placing orange markers along the faint tire impressions. The heat shimmered above the sand, making the horizon blur. Salinas walked slowly beside the tracks, his face glistening with sweat, his eyes fixed on the ground. The distance between the marks was almost exactly the width of a small car. Melissa's car. The tracks curved gently toward a patch of uneven earth. Something dark lay there, barely visible under a thin film of dust. A technician crouched down and brushed the sand away with a gloved hand. A small patch of dried reddish-brown soil appeared. It was no larger than a handprint. At first they thought it might be oil, but when a test strip touched the surface, it turned purple. Blood. The entire area fell silent. No one spoke. The desert wind passed through the dry air like a low whisper. Under the sun's glare, the patch of earth seemed darker, heavier, as if holding the memory of what had happened there. Samples were taken immediately, carefully scraped into vials, each one labeled and sealed. As they worked, one of the younger officers called out softly. Something glittered in the sand near a small cluster of rocks. He knelt, brushing the dust away, and lifted a tiny gold earring from the ground, a teardrop shape with a small bead at the center. It sparkled weakly under the sunlight. Salinas stared at it, the color draining from his face. He remembered the photo from the missing person file. Melissa, smiling shyly, wearing that exact pair. The discovery hit everyone differently. Some stood in silence, others looked away toward the mountains. The earring was carefully sealed in an evidence bag. The tag marked Item 14B. The blood and the jewelry together told a story no one wanted to believe. Technicians continued their work under the searing sun. Cameras clicked. GPS coordinates were logged. The smell of hot metal and sand filled the air. One of the forensic specialists used a small spray to reveal the outline of drag marks near the tire tracks. Shallow, uneven lines stretching a few meters before disappearing. The desert had tried to cover them, but not completely. By the time the team packed up, the temperature had climbed past 110 degrees. One officer collapsed briefly from heat exhaustion, and another helped him to the vehicle. Yet no one was ready to leave. The desert was beginning to speak, but only in fragments, faint tire tracks, a drop of blood, and a single gold earring left behind in the sand. When the samples reached the city lab later that evening, the results confirmed what everyone already feared. The blood was human, type O positive, the same as Melissa Duran's. That night, as the last rays of sun slipped behind the mountains, Major Salinas stood at the edge of the search site, staring at the glowing city lights far below. The wind carried the sound of distant traffic, thin and lonely, somewhere in that vast stretch of desert. The truth was still buried, waiting to be uncovered. And the question that haunted him most was not where Melissa had gone, but why she had been brought there at all. The discovery of blood and a gold earring had shaken everyone. The search teams knew now that Melissa had not simply wandered off or left by choice. Something violent had happened on that desert ground. Still, there was one question that kept echoing in Major Salinas' mind. How had she ended up there? For days, investigators went through every piece of footage from cameras along Montana Avenue. Most were useless, grainy, low quality, or overwritten after 24 hours. But one old camera mounted above a car repair shop just a few hundred meters from the convenience store captured something strange. At 6:59 p.m., Melissa's silver Toyota Corolla could be seen pulling out of the store's parking lot. A few cars followed behind, but one stood out. A black Ford pickup, its headlights flickering through the haze following the same direction. The truck stayed at a steady distance through 3 intersections, never overtaking, never falling too far back. Technicians zoomed in, adjusting the contrast frame by frame. The sunlight glare made the license plate unreadable except for 3 faint characters at the end, 5, 9, and X. It was not much, but it was a thread. Salinas leaned closer to the screen, his face hardening. Whoever drove that truck had followed her. Within hours, the police cross-checked every registered black Ford F-150 in El Paso County and neighboring areas. More than 400 matched the partial description. Some belonged to construction firms, others to private owners. It was like trying to find a single grain of sand in the desert. To dig deeper, they returned to the convenience store and re-interviewed the evening clerk, a young woman named Sofia Torres. She remembered Melissa clearly. A polite customer, tired but kind. Sofia said she noticed a man outside the store that evening. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a red cap, standing near a pole beside the parking lot. He never came inside. He just stood there staring through the glass as Melissa paid for her items. When she stepped out, he watched her walk to her car and then climbed into a black vehicle parked across the street. She remembered his movements clearly, slow and deliberate. When asked to describe his face, Sofia hesitated. She had not seen it well, only his eyes, calm but focused, like he had been waiting for something. Detectives worked with her to create a composite sketch. A light-skinned man around 40, average build, short hair, red baseball cap. The sketch was circulated to every precinct in the region. It appeared briefly on local news broadcasts, and dozens of tips came in during the next 48 hours. Each one led nowhere. The truck was never found. The driver was never identified. The more they searched, the less sense the case made. Inside the El Paso police station, the investigation board filled with photos, maps, and red strings connecting dates and times. At its center was a still image of the black truck, circled in red marker. Salinas stood in front of it late one evening, the hum of the fluorescent lights echoing in the quiet room. Around him, tired officers sifted through files, voices low, energy fading. One of them whispered that maybe she had known the man, that maybe it was someone from her past. Salinas shook his head slowly. If she knew him, she would not have run. Weeks passed, and the desert wind erased the tracks they had once followed. The media attention faded, and the city moved on. But for the investigators, the mystery only grew heavier. Somewhere out there was a man in a red cap who had followed Melissa Duran into the dark and then disappeared the sketch of the man in the red cap had filled bulletin boards across the city. Yet no one came forward with a match. Days turned into weeks and each lead dissolved into dust. Major Salinas knew that following the shadow of a truck would not be enough. The focus had to return to the people who truly knew Melissa. The first name on his list was David Ramirez, her ex-boyfriend. David worked as a refrigeration technician in the South Industrial area. He and Melissa had dated for almost 2 years before ending their relationship. 4 months before she disappeared, officers brought him in for questioning on a humid Monday morning. He looked exhausted, his hands trembling slightly as he signed the statement form. David explained that the breakup had been calm, that Melissa had wanted time to focus on her career and certification exams. He claimed he had been working a night shift the evening she vanished. Police checked the warehouse logs. His supervisor confirmed his presence from 5 in the evening until 2 in the morning. Security footage showed him moving between aisles, tools in hand, sweat soaking through his shirt. His DNA was collected and compared to the samples from the Toyota Corolla. No match. When the results came back, Salinas closed the file quietly and slid it to the side. He was not convinced David had any reason to harm her, but he also knew that every time a name was cleared, the road ahead grew emptier. The next person under review was Thomas Green, a co-worker from the El Paso County Public Service Center. Several colleagues whispered about tension between him and Melissa. She had reported him for verbal harassment at work, leading to his temporary suspension 2 weeks before she went missing. When investigators arrived at his home, Green's face turned pale. His wife stood beside him, nervous, arms crossed. Green claimed he had spent that Friday night at home watching a baseball game. His wife confirmed it, though her tone carried hesitation. Officers obtained a warrant to search his truck, a faded blue pickup parked under a layer of dust. Inside, they found nothing unusual. No blood traces, no fibers, no link to Melissa. Still, they took hair samples and fingerprints. Days later, the lab confirmed no connection to the evidence collected from the desert or the Corolla. Once again, another door closed. Weeks passed, and the whiteboard in the investigation room began to look more like a wall of unanswered questions. Photos of Melissa, the black Ford truck, and the map of Montana Avenue were joined by dozens of notes and arrows, each pointing nowhere. The air inside the precinct grew heavier each day. The team worked long hours, but every lead ended in silence. The local news that had once run daily updates soon turned its attention elsewhere. The missing woman from El Paso became a small mention buried between reports of weather and traffic. Cameras stopped showing up at police briefings. The public stopped calling in tips. The story that had once gripped the city was fading away. But Major Salinas did not forget. Every evening after the others went home, he remained in his office, the room dim except for the desk lamp's glow. He would reopen the Duran file, flipping through pages already marked with notes and fingerprints. On the last page, he had written 3 words in bold ink: "Find the truck." Sometimes he drove out alone toward Trans Mountain Road, parking near the spot where Melissa's car had been found. He would sit in silence, the desert wind whispering through the open window, the sand shifting endlessly as if trying to cover what it once witnessed. The case had stalled, but for Salinas, it was never over. It lingered like a faint echo at the edge of every quiet night, and somewhere beyond those mountains, the truth still waited, buried beneath years of wind and silence, waiting for someone to listen again. By the summer of 2005, the file that once consumed every corner of the El Paso Police Department was no longer a daily priority. The search funds had run out, the leads had gone dry, and the hope that once fueled the team had faded into quiet acceptance. After 2 years of investigation, Melissa Duran's case was officially archived under one simple label: Cold Case. The report was boxed, sealed, and moved to the evidence vault in the basement of the old police headquarters. Inside that dimly lit room, metal shelves stretched from wall to wall, each filled with cardboard boxes bearing names, dates, and case numbers. When a clerk carefully placed the Duran file on the 3rd row, the black marker label smudged slightly from sweat. Few noticed and fewer cared. To the department, it was another unresolved mystery in a city full of them. Inside the box were fragments of a story no one could finish. A gold earring wrapped in a plastic bag, a gas receipt folded neatly, a swab sealed in a tube labeled DNA insufficient, and a stack of photos showing sand, tire tracks, and shadows that once held meaning. Each item was carefully cataloged, yet without context. They were just objects waiting for someone to remember why they mattered. Years drifted by. El Paso grew busier, brighter, louder. Montana Avenue changed. The convenience store where Melissa was last seen was remodeled into a fast food restaurant. The sign came down, the old camera removed, and new neon lights replaced the ones that had flickered over her last moments. People moved on, and the story of the young woman who vanished one summer evening became a quiet whisper, a name occasionally mentioned by older officers and long forgotten by most. For the Duran family, time did not soften the ache. Every July, Rosa Duran drove with her relatives to the place near Trans Mountain Road, where Melissa's car had been found. They placed daisies on the sand and lit candles that struggled against the desert wind. Rosa would sit silently, her hand resting on a small wooden marker with her daughter's name carved by hand. Each year she whispered the same words into the wind. "Just let me know where you are inside the precinct." Major Salinas continued to carry the case even after he retired in 2008. On his final day, as he packed his belongings, he found an old note folded inside his desk drawer. It was written in his own handwriting years earlier. Black Ford, plate ending 59X, triangle tattoo. He slipped the note into his wallet and walked out of the station without saying much. Time rolled forward, but the box stayed still. Dust settled over it. The fluorescent light in the evidence vault flickered occasionally, casting long shadows over rows of forgotten stories. Then in 2013, the department moved to a new building. Workers transferred hundreds of cold case boxes to a modern storage facility. When a young clerk lifted the Duran file, she paused, reading the faded label. She turned to her supervisor and asked why it was never marked closed. The man shrugged softly and said, "No body, no suspect, no answer." The box was placed on a new shelf. The lock clicked shut and silence returned. Years passed again, the kind that erase names from memory and turn headlines into footnotes. But the desert never forgets. The wind that once carried dust across Trans Mountain still whispered over that same patch of sand where a gold earring was found long ago. And while the world moved on, the truth remained buried, waiting for a reason, or a person, to bring it back into the light. 17 years had passed since the summer night when Melissa Duran vanished, and the case that once gripped El Paso had become little more than a line in the city's archive. But fate has a way of circling back, and in 2020, a quiet revolution in forensic science began breathing life into stories that the world had forgotten. Lieutenant Carla Mendez was one of the new generation officers in the El Paso Police Department. Sharp, patient, and driven by a quiet sense of justice, she had joined the force after studying forensic criminology in San Antonio. When she was appointed to lead the department's newly formed cold case unit, she did not realize that her very first assignment would be a case older than some of her officers. On her second week in the unit, she walked through the evidence storage vault, a vast, climate-controlled room lined with hundreds of metal shelves. Dust had no place there, but time still weighed heavy. Her eyes moved across the rows of names until one box caught her attention. It was labeled Duran Melissa, 2003. The edges were worn, the handwriting faded. She pulled it down, opened the lid, and began to read. Inside were fragments of a tragedy, photographs of a sun-bleached car, a gold earring sealed in a plastic bag, a blood report too weak to analyze with the technology of that time. Mendez read through every page, every note, and by the time she reached the final report, she knew this case had never truly been finished. That same year, El Paso's cold case unit partnered with a private research facility, Orem Forensic Laboratories, one of the few in the country specializing in advanced DNA and genealogical tracing. New methods could now extract genetic information from samples once considered too degraded to test. It was a breakthrough that had solved other forgotten cases across the country. Mendez believed it could do the same here. She contacted Orem Labs immediately. The next morning, she signed a request to re-examine every biological trace from the Duran case. The blood swab from the desert soil, the faint print residue from the car handle, and even the sealed tube marked DNA insufficient. The old evidence, untouched for nearly 2 decades, was carefully packed into new sterile containers and shipped under controlled temperature to Orum's facility in Austin. Weeks passed as Mendes waited for updates. During that time, she studied every report from the original investigation: the interviews, the car inspection, the red cap sketch, the unknown fingerprint. She spoke with retired Major Salinas, now in his 70s, who still kept a small note pinned above his desk that read, "Find the truck." His voice trembled with age, but his memory was sharp. When he heard the case was reopened, he said softly, "The desert never hides forever. It only waits for the right eyes to look again." In early autumn of 2020, Mendes received an email from Orum Labs with the subject line, "Partial DNA profile recovered. Duran case." Her heart raced as she opened the file. Against all odds, modern sequencing had extracted a usable genetic profile from the degraded material on the car's door handle. Something technology in 2003 could never have done. The lab's team immediately began building a genetic genealogy tree, comparing the unknown DNA to thousands of public and private databases. They hoped to find a distant relative, a trace of a family line, anything that could point to the person who had touched that car nearly 20 years ago. Lieutenant Mendes printed the report, placed it beside the old photo of Melissa Duran, and whispered under her breath, "We are finally starting to hear your story again." What began as a forgotten box of evidence was now turning into a chain of discovery that would shake the city once more. And what those lab results would reveal would uncover a name no one had expected. A name that had walked freely through El Paso all those years, unnoticed and unpunished. When the first results from Orum Forensic Laboratories arrived, the entire cold case unit fell silent. The report was brief, only a few pages, but it held the kind of information investigators wait their entire careers to see. The DNA recovered from the handle of Melissa Duran's Toyota Corolla had produced a partial genetic match to several individuals across the country. None were direct hits, but all were related to one family name, Harland. Lieutenant Carla Mendes leaned over the printout, tracing the branching lines of the genealogical tree built by the lab's analysts. From distant cousins to second and third relatives, every thread led to the same ancestral root. The Harlan family line stretched deep through Texas and New Mexico, with one name standing out from the records: Jacob Harland, age 51, a mechanical engineer who had lived in El Paso his entire life. The more they read about him, the more unsettling the details became. Jacob lived alone in a quiet neighborhood near Mesa Hills. He had no criminal record, no public disputes, no history of violence. Yet his name appeared in an old traffic citation database, a minor speeding ticket dated July 18, 2003. The same night Melissa Duran vanished. The location of the ticket was even more disturbing. It was issued at 7:45 p.m. on Highway 62, barely 5 miles north of the convenience store where Melissa was last seen. That connection sent a chill through the entire department. Mendes stared at the screen, her heart steady but heavy. For 17 years the case had pointed toward shadows and unknown faces. Now finally a real person stood in the center of it. A man who had crossed paths with Melissa on that night, and somehow slipped through every layer of the investigation. To confirm the finding, the team ordered an expanded genealogical analysis. The lab technicians ran the unknown DNA against thousands of database entries, tracing shared markers and ancestral patterns until one result appeared, a near-perfect correlation with the Harlan genetic profile. When the probability report came back, the number was clear. The match likelihood exceeded 99.6%. Lieutenant Mendes called a quiet meeting with her team that afternoon. The air in the room was tense as she placed the file on the table. She explained the connection, the speeding citation, and the genetic confirmation. There were no dramatic reactions, only a deep collective stillness. After nearly 2 decades, the case finally had a name that fit the evidence. Later that night, Mendes drove alone to the same stretch of highway where the ticket had been issued. The road was empty now, lit only by the pale glow of distant city lights. She pulled over and stepped out, feeling the dry wind sweep across her face. Somewhere near this road, the paths of 2 lives had crossed, one belonging to a woman who never came home, and the other to the man who may have taken her there. She looked out across the dark outline of the Franklin Mountains and whispered to herself, "We found you." But finding a name was not the same as finding proof. Before the world could know who Jacob Harland really was, the investigators would have to watch him, follow him, and gather what time had hidden. And what they were about to uncover would leave no doubt that justice had only been sleeping, waiting to wake again. The name Jacob Harland had given the investigation new life, but Lieutenant Carla Mendes knew that a name alone was not enough to close a 20-year-old wound. What she needed now was proof, solid, irrefutable evidence that tied this man not just to a family tree, but to the night Melissa Duran vanished. Within days, a small undercover team began quiet surveillance of Jacob's home. He lived on a quiet street in West El Paso, a modest single-story house with a well-kept lawn and a dark green pickup parked in the driveway. To the neighbors, he was ordinary, polite, quiet, a man who waved from a distance but never lingered to talk. But to Mendes, he was a storm hidden behind calm skies. The team monitored his daily routine from unmarked cars. Each morning, Jacob left for work at a mechanical parts factory and returned just after sunset. But what caught everyone's attention were his late-night drives. Around 11, he would often leave the house again, heading toward the outskirts of the city, the same direction that led toward the Franklin Mountains. He would stay there for half an hour, sometimes longer, before returning home in silence. Those drives disturbed Mendes. Each time he drove into the darkness, she wondered if he was revisiting the place where everything had begun. After 2 weeks of surveillance, she authorized a covert DNA collection. The team waited for the right opportunity. One morning, they watched as Jacob rolled his trash bin to the curb before leaving for work. Inside were coffee cups, food wrappers, and a used tissue. Officers collected the discarded bag discreetly, sealing it inside an evidence container. Every move was by the book, clean, legal, and careful. A second sample was collected days later from a used toothbrush found inside his trash during routine pickup. Both samples were sent to Orem Labs under high priority. The results took 7 days to arrive, and during that week, no one in the cold case unit slept peacefully. Every passing hour felt like standing at the edge of revelation. On a gray Friday morning, Mendes received a call from the lab director himself. His voice was steady, measured, but there was something in his tone that made her heart stop. The DNA recovered from Jacob Harland's discarded items was a 99.99% match to the genetic profile found on the handle of Melissa Duran's car. There was no longer any doubt. After 17 years of silence, the ghost in the evidence file finally had a face. Mendes placed the phone down slowly. For a long moment, the room felt still, as though time itself was holding its breath. The faces of her team mirrored her own, relief, disbelief, and anger blending into one quiet determination. The truth had finally been uncovered, and the man who had hidden behind the mask of normalcy for nearly 2 decades had been caught by the very science that did not exist when he took Melissa's life. As she looked at the photograph of Jacob Harland now pinned to the caseboard, Mendes whispered to herself that the desert had kept its promise after all. It had not forgotten. It had only waited. But if Jacob Harland was capable of hiding in plain sight for 20 years, one question remained. What would he do when he realized the past had finally found him? By early 2023, after months of surveillance and quiet verification, Lieutenant Carla Mendes knew the time had come. Every lead, every test, every sleepless night had brought her and her team to this moment. The evidence was airtight, The DNA match was undeniable. The digital records of his movements connected too perfectly to the night Melissa vanished. The man who had lived freely for 20 years was about to face the truth he thought would never catch up to him. At 4:30 in the morning, an unmarked convoy of vehicles rolled out from the El Paso police headquarters under a pale gray sky. The team had coordinated closely with the FBI's Tucson division after learning that Jacob Harland had recently moved across the state line for contract work. He was renting a small property on the edge of Tucson's industrial district, quiet, isolated, the kind of place built for someone who did not want to be seen. The convoy moved through the empty streets with only the hum of engines breaking the silence. Mendes sat in the lead vehicle, reviewing the operation plan one last time. Her hands were steady, but her chest felt heavy. She had waited years for this, not for glory, but for closure, for Melissa, for Rosa Duran, and for every case file that had ever gathered dust waiting for justice. At 5:12 a.m., the vehicles stopped 2 blocks from the target address. The street was dimly lit, the horizon still faint with the coming sunrise. Tactical officers took their positions, moving silently along the fence line. The wind carried the scent of rain and metal. The command was given. A loud crash broke the morning calm as the front door burst open. Voices filled the air, sharp, commanding, unmistakable. Jacob Harland stumbled from his bedroom, confused, his hands raised. Years of hiding collapsed in a single moment. His face was pale, eyes darting between the armed officers who surrounded him. Mendes stepped forward as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He looked at her with a faint, bitter smile and said quietly, "You still have not forgotten." Her voice was firm but calm. Neither did she. The weight of the years pressed heavily over that small room. Dust floated in the beam of flashlights, and the silence that followed felt colder than the air itself. Officers searched the property, cataloging everything. Clothing, electronics, old photos, and tools neatly arranged on a workbench. Nothing overtly incriminating, but all of it sealed carefully for evidence. Outside, dawn finally broke. The first light of morning fell across Jacob's face as he was led toward the vehicle. For a brief moment he turned his head toward the distant mountains, the same range that had hidden his secret for so long. There was no resistance, no plea, only a quiet surrender to the truth that had finally found him. By noon, the official statement was released. The El Paso Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation confirmed the arrest of 54-year-old Jacob Allen Harland. He was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and tampering with evidence in connection with the 2003 disappearance of Melissa Duran. The city that had forgotten her name now heard it again, this time followed by a word it had waited 2 decades to hear: justice. But even with the arrest made, the mystery was not complete. Investigators still needed what every story of truth requires: a confession, and the final answer to the question that haunted everyone for 20 long years. The arrest of Jacob Harland had stirred the entire city of El Paso. News stations replayed his image on every channel. Headlines echoed across social media, and the Duran family sat quietly at home, holding each other as they listened to the words they had waited to hear for 20 years. But for Lieutenant Carla Mendes, the work was not over. She knew that the final piece of this story would not come from a courtroom. It had to come from Jacob himself. Inside the interrogation room, the air was thick and still. The clock on the wall ticked softly as Jacob sat across from Mendes, his wrists cuffed, his posture calm, almost detached. A single light hung above the table, casting shadows that deepened the lines in his face. He was older now, gray in his hair, worn by years of pretending to be ordinary. Mendes watched him carefully, waiting for the first crack in his composure. For hours he said nothing. Only when she placed a photograph of Melissa Duran in front of him did his eyes shift. He stared at it for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost fragile. He said he had known her, not personally, but from passing visits to the same store. He described her as kind, polite, the type of person who smiled even when she was tired. Then his tone hardened. He said, "I lost control." The words hung in the air like the slow pull of gravity. Mendes leaned forward, her voice steady as she asked him to explain. Jacob took a long breath and said that on the night of July 18, 2003, he had seen Melissa at the store and followed her when she left. He said he only wanted to talk to her, but something went wrong. His mind blurred with anger, with impulse, with something darker he could not name. He claimed he never meant for her to die. He said it happened fast, that too fast to stop. Tears never came. But his voice trembled when he said he panicked, that he had driven north toward the Franklin Mountains, searching for a place where no one would find her. When Mendes asked him where, he looked up, his eyes heavy with the weight of memory, and said, "You will not find her by accident." Then he reached for the notepad on the table. With slow, deliberate strokes, he drew a rough outline of the mountain ridge. His hands shook slightly as he marked a narrow dirt trail branching from Trans Mountain Road. Near the curve of that line, he drew an arrow pointing to a shaded area and scribbled 3 words beside it. Tarp. Broken pole, rock shaped like an arrowhead. When he finished, he slid the paper across the table and whispered, "She is there." Mendes stared at the drawing, her pulse rising. The details were too specific to ignore. She carefully folded the page and handed it to the forensic team waiting outside the room. They would head to the location as soon as daylight came. Jacob sat back in his chair, the confession draining him. When Mendes asked why he had kept silent all these years, he said he thought time would bury everything. The evidence, the guilt, even the memory. But when the police came to his door, he realized something. He said, "The desert never forgets. It only waits." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the air conditioner hummed softly, and the weight of 2 decades of silence seemed to press against the walls. Mendes stood slowly, gathered her notes, and walked toward the door. Behind her, Jacob sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the faint reflection of light on the table. Outside, officers were already preparing to move toward the site marked on his drawing. And as the sun began to rise over the mountains that had guarded the truth for 20 long years, the desert was about to give up its secret. The map Jacob Harland had drawn was crude and shaky, but it was all Lieutenant Carla Mendes needed. By dawn, a convoy of forensic trucks and police units moved slowly along Trans Mountain Road, their tires stirring clouds of pale dust that drifted across the rising sun. The air was dry and heavy, and the mountains stood silent, watching as the search returned to the same desert that had hidden its secret for 2 decades. At 7:40 a.m., the team reached the area marked on Harland's drawing. The dirt trail was narrow, covered with rocks and wild brush. They followed it for nearly half a mile until one of the technicians stopped, pointing toward a cluster of boulders shaped like an arrowhead, exactly as Harland had described. Nearby stood a broken wooden pole, half buried in sand, its top splintered and gray from years of wind and sun. Mendes stepped closer, her boots crunching against the dry soil. Every detail matched his confession. She nodded to the forensic team, who began the slow process of excavation. The desert wind howled faintly, carrying the sound of shovels scraping the earth. Hours passed before one of the technicians called out softly. Something pale had appeared beneath the sand, a fragment of bone. The digging slowed. With brushes and precision tools, they worked carefully until a full outline began to emerge. The remains of a human body wrapped in the faint traces of a decayed tarp. Around the neck, fragments of twisted nylon cord were still visible, hardened and darkened by time. The desert had indeed kept its promise. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause. Lieutenant Mendes stepped forward, her heart heavy, her voice quiet as she instructed the team to preserve everything. Every bone, every fabric thread, every trace of the scene was documented and sealed. The remains were gently lifted and placed inside a transport case. The gold earring that had once been found years earlier, was matched with the faint indentation still visible on the skull. When the remains reached the city lab later that night, the forensic pathologist confirmed what Mendes already suspected. Cause of death: ligature strangulation consistent with nylon cord pressure. The case that had begun in confusion and silence now had its truth, carved painfully but clearly into the record. A few days later, DNA testing provided the final confirmation. The genetic sequence matched perfectly with Rosa Duran, Melissa's mother. There was no more uncertainty, no more waiting. The woman who had disappeared into the desert in 2003 had finally come home. That evening, Mendes drove to Rosa's small house on the east side of the city. The air smelled faintly of rain and the porch light flickered in the wind. Rosa opened the door slowly, her eyes tired but calm. Mendes did not need to say much. She held out a small envelope. Inside was a photo of the gold earring and a note confirming identification. Rosa's hands trembled as she touched the photo. Her eyes filled with tears, not of surprise, but of relief. After so many years of wondering, she finally knew where her daughter rested. Mendes stayed for a while, sitting quietly in the living room as Rosa lit a candle and whispered a prayer. The light flickered softly against the framed photo of Melissa that hung on the wall. Outside, the sound of wind swept across the street, gentle now, almost peaceful. For the first time in 20 years, the desert had given back what it had taken. But while the truth had been found, justice was not yet done, and in a courtroom soon to come, the man who once believed he had escaped time would finally face what he had buried beneath the sand. The discovery of Melissa Duran's remains sent a wave of emotion through El Paso. For 2 decades, her name had been a whisper, her case a memory fading beneath layers of dust and time. But now it had risen back into the light. The police station was quiet the morning after the recovery. Lieutenant Carla Mendes stood before the evidence board, staring at the photograph of the silver Toyota Corolla, the faded map Jacob Harland had drawn, and the small gold earring that had once caught the desert sunlight. Each piece told a story that no one could deny anymore. The case was complete. Now came the hardest part: justice in court. Federal prosecutor Alicia Moreno took charge of the legal proceedings. Known for her calm but relentless precision, she was the kind of attorney who believed that facts spoke louder than emotion. Inside the Western District of Texas courthouse, the grand jury gathered in a private session. No cameras, no reporters, only silence and the sound of Moreno's voice as she began her presentation. She walked to the center of the room and projected the first image. Melissa Duran's graduation photo beside the image of the Franklin Desert where her remains had been found. The jurors sat still, watching as Moreno outlined the case piece by piece. She explained how the cold case had been revived after 17 years through new forensic technology, how a single degraded swab from a car door handle had led them to a family tree in Arizona, and how every branch of that tree had pointed toward one man, Jacob Edward Harland. She presented the DNA evidence, a complete match across 21 genetic markers. She showed the hand-drawn map Jacob had created during his confession, matching every landmark the forensic team later found. The courtroom projector flickered as she displayed photos of the excavation site, the broken pole, the arrow-shaped rock, and the tarp where Melissa had been buried. Each image carried its own silence, heavier than words. Then came the most damning evidence on the rope fragments recovered from Jacob's truck. The nylon fibers matched exactly the ones found around Melissa's neck. The probability of coincidence, Moreno explained, was smaller than 1 in 10 billion. The room grew tense. Jurors exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief, and then to quiet anger. Moreno closed her file and faced them with steady eyes. Her voice softened as she spoke of the Duran family's 20 years of waiting. A mother who kept the same phone number for 2 decades, hoping her daughter might one day call. A case that everyone thought was forgotten until science, patience, and persistence brought the truth back from the dust. She paused and said, This is not only about one woman. This is about every voice that went silent because someone thought time could bury truth. When the presentation ended, the jurors deliberated in stillness. It did not take long. One by one, they raised their hands in agreement. By a near unanimous vote, they indicted Jacob Harland on 3 charges: kidnapping resulting in death, first-degree murder, and tampering with physical evidence. That afternoon, the news spread through the city like wildfire. Headlines filled every screen and newspaper. Justice for Melissa Duran. Federal grand jury indicts suspect after 20 years. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse. Some brought flowers, others simply stood in silence. At the police station, Mendes watched the news coverage from her desk. She felt no celebration, only a deep, quiet relief. Justice was finally moving, but she also knew this was not the end. Because now the story would move from the field to the courtroom, where every piece of truth would be tested once more. And as the sun set over the Franklin Mountains, painting the desert in shades of red and gold, the people of El Paso waited for what would come next, in the moment when a jury of 12 would decide whether a man's 20 years of silence would finally meet its reckoning. The courthouse in El Paso stood taller than ever that morning, its glass walls glinting under the desert sun. Crowds had already gathered outside before the trial even began, holding photos of Melissa Duran and signs that read words like truth and justice. After 20 long years, the city was ready to watch the case that had haunted it finally reach its end. Inside courtroom 4B, the air was heavy with tension. Reporters filled the back rows, notebooks open, cameras lowered in silence. At the front, federal prosecutor Alicia Moreno stood beside a table stacked high with files, evidence photos, and DNA reports. Across from her sat the defense attorney Thomas Kepler, calm and calculating, adjusting his glasses as if he already knew how far he could stretch the line of doubt. At the center of it all sat Jacob Harland, dressed in a plain shirt, wrists cuffed loosely, his face empty of emotion. He stared forward, neither angry nor afraid, as if the outcome no longer mattered. Judge Samuel O'Reilly entered, his voice deep and commanding, as he reminded the jurors that their duty was to truth alone. The case was long, the evidence complex, but in the end, it would come down to one question. Had Jacob Harland taken the life of Melissa Duran on that summer night in 2003? Alicia Moreno began her opening statement slowly, with no theatrics, only calm determination. She spoke of the heat of that July evening, of a young woman walking out of a store unaware that her last moments were being recorded by a security camera. She described how the investigation had once faded into silence, until modern science revived the truth. Then she turned toward the jury and said, "Time does not erase guilt. It only waits for the right eyes to see it." She presented the DNA evidence first. The swab from the Toyota Corolla's door handle, preserved for years, had finally yielded a full genetic profile. The lab's report glowed on the courtroom screen. 21 markers, all identical to Jacob Harland's sample. The probability of a false match was 1 in 7 billion. The jurors watched the numbers projected on the screen as if looking at undeniable fate. Next came the forensic proof. Photographs of the excavation site filled the room. The arrow-shaped rock, the nylon cord, the tarp, and the bones of Melissa Duran. The nylon rope found in Jacob's truck matched the same polymer composition and twist pattern as the ligature found around Melissa's neck. Dr. Laura Keene, the lead forensic analyst, testified clearly that the pressure pattern on the neck bones showed deliberate force, not accident, not impulse, intent. Then came the moment everyone waited for, the recording of Jacob's confession. The room was silent as his voice played through the speakers. Calm, flat, saying words that froze the air. "I lost control." A murmur rippled across the audience. Rosa Duran, sitting in the front row, held her daughter's scarf tightly against her chest. Lieutenant Carla Mendes sat beside her, her eyes fixed on Jacob, her jaw clenched. Every moment of her 20-year pursuit was unfolding right there before her. When it was the defense's turn, Thomas Kepler stood and adjusted his tie. His voice was smooth and deliberate. He did not argue the presence of DNA. He did not deny Jacob's words. Instead, he turned the battle toward ethics. He questioned the use of forensic genealogy, the idea that private DNA databases could be used to track a man without consent. He told the jury that justice must follow rules, and when science goes too far, anyone could be accused. He spoke softly but firmly, painting Jacob as a man caught in the storm of modern technology and human error. The courtroom felt divided. For a moment, even the jurors looked uncertain. But then Alicia Moreno stood again for the prosecution's closing statement. She walked to the center of the room, no notes in her hand, only Melissa's graduation photo. Her voice carried through the hall like the slow rise of a storm. She said that DNA was not a guess, that every fiber of evidence pointed to the same truth. She spoke of the map Jacob drew, the confession he made, the rope that ended a young life. She paused, holding the photo higher, her tone clear and unwavering. Justice has no expiration date. It does not fade with years or distance. It only waits for courage to find it. The room was silent. The judge nodded for the jury to deliberate. Hours passed slowly, the clock echoing through the hallway as the people of El Paso waited. Then at 6:10 p.m., the doors opened. The jurors filed back into the courtroom. None of them looked up. The forewoman stood holding a folded paper. Her voice trembled slightly as she read the verdict, guilty on all counts. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the sound of quiet sobs filled the air. Rosa Duran covered her face with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Mendes closed her eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath. Jacob sat still, his expression unchanged. It was as if the weight of the words had not yet reached him. Outside, as the verdict spread across the city, church bells rang from the old streets of downtown El Paso. After 2 decades, the people who had once searched in the blazing desert could finally whisper a single word that carried both sorrow and peace: justice. But though the verdict had been read, one final chapter remained, the day when the man who buried truth beneath the desert would hear his final sentence. The courtroom was quiet that morning. A different kind of silence, not tense like before, but heavy with finality. The long trial was over, the verdict had been read, and now the last page of the story was about to be written. Reporters filled the back rows again, their pens poised, but even they seemed subdued. Everyone knew what this moment meant. At the front, Jacob Harlan stood motionless between 2 federal marshals. He looked smaller than before, older somehow, as if the weight of truth had finally begun to press down on him. His hands trembled slightly, though his face remained expressionless. In front of him sat the Duran family, their faces calm but unbroken, 20 years of pain and waiting distilled into one final moment of justice. Judge O'Reilly entered the courtroom and adjusted his glasses before speaking. He reviewed the charges: first-degree murder, aggravated kidnapping, and tampering with physical evidence. Then he looked toward the prosecution table. Before sentencing, he said quietly, the court will now hear the victim's family. Rosa Duran stood slowly. Her hands clutched a small piece of paper, but she did not read from it. Her voice was soft, weathered by time, but strong enough to fill the room. She said she had waited 20 years for this day. 20 years of waking up each morning wondering if her daughter was cold, if she was alone, if she was afraid. She spoke of birthdays that passed with an empty chair at the table, of candles that were lit but never blown out. Then she looked directly at Jacob, and for a moment every sound in the courtroom disappeared. She said, "You took her life, but you did not take her spirit. You buried her body, but not her truth. That truth found its way home." The courtroom was silent. Even the marshals lowered their eyes. Rosa wiped her tears and sat down, her hand resting on the photograph of her daughter. Judge O'Reilly took a deep breath before speaking again. He said justice had no timeline, that no matter how long it takes, the truth always finds its voice. Then he read the sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As the gavel struck, a sound echoed through the courtroom like the closing of a door that had been open for far too long. Jacob Harlan showed no emotion. He simply lowered his head as the marshals took him by the arms and led him away. The door shut behind him, and for the first time in 20 years, the case of Melissa Duran was truly closed. Outside the courthouse, the sky was bright and clear. Reporters spoke softly into their microphones as Rosa and her family stepped into the sunlight. Lieutenant Carla Mendes walked beside her, the weight of years finally lifting from her shoulders. She had promised herself that this case would not end in silence, and she had kept that promise. Later that evening, Mendes stood alone on Trans Mountain Road, near the place where Melissa had once vanished. The desert was quiet again, the same wind moving through the rocks as it had on that night in 2003. She looked out over the horizon, the fading sun painting the sand gold and red. She whispered to herself that justice may have been delayed, but it was never denied. And as the last light faded behind the mountains, it felt as if the desert itself had finally exhaled, releasing the truth it had held for 20 long years. But even in peace, there was one question that lingered in the air. How many other stories still lie buried beneath the silence, waiting for someone brave enough to listen? The sun rose gently over El Paso that morning, warm light spreading across the quiet streets and distant hills. It was not the same city it once was. The case that had lived in shadows for 20 years had changed something deeper, a reminder that time may fade memory, but it never erases truth. A small crowd gathered at Evergreen Cemetery for the funeral. Rows of white chairs lined the grass, the air still and heavy with emotion. The Duran family stood near the front, surrounded by friends, detectives, and people who had followed Melissa's story since the beginning. Among them was Lieutenant Carla Mendes, standing quietly at the edge, her eyes lowered as the priest began to speak. The ceremony was simple. No long speeches, no rehearsed words, only silence and soft wind. Rosa Duran held a small wooden box in her hands, and inside was the gold earring that had once been found in the desert. The same earring that had helped bring her daughter home. She placed it gently beside the coffin, whispering a prayer only a mother could understand. When the final hymn faded, Mendes stepped forward. She knelt beside the grave, her hand resting on the fresh earth. For years she had chased this case through files, dust, and doubt, but now, looking at the small name carved in stone, she felt a quiet peace. The investigation was over. The silence had finally spoken. Weeks later, a monument was unveiled in the heart of El Paso, a tall bronze figure of a woman looking toward the Franklin Mountains. It was called the Monument for the Missing. Beneath her feet were engraved the names of men and women who had disappeared across the Texas desert and were never found. At the base of the statue were 5 words that echoed through the crowd. No one vanishes forever. We just have not dug deep enough. Those words were chosen by Mendes herself. They were not only for Melissa, but for every story that still waits to be heard. The monument became a place of quiet reflection, where people came not only to mourn but to remember that truth, like the desert wind, never really dies. It only waits for someone to listen. As the evening sun dipped behind the mountains, the sky turned gold and crimson, the same colors that had filled the air on the night Melissa disappeared. And in that fading light, it felt as if the desert itself had kept its promise, holding the truth until humanity was ready to uncover it. If you are still watching this story till now, it means this story touched your heart. So please give it a like and subscribe to my channel, Unscripted Tales. Turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next story we bring to life. And please help me reach 5,000 likes on this story. That is a promise I made to my mother. And your one click can make it happen. Tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this story. I read every single one of your comments, and it means the world to me. Because stories like this remind us, truth may sleep, but it never disappears.